Chapter 11. Ellison looked down at the ground, still ashamed to this day that he'd left Sarah behind. He'd saved Savannah's life in doing so, and he'd never regret that for a moment, but still, he'd felt nothing but guilt about what happened to her. I took Savannah, left LA as soon as we could, and we drove south into Mexico. He wasn't going to tell John that he'd watched fire crews on TV picking over his house the next day, or how the news anchor reported 9 bodies, including his mother, had been burnt down to charred skeletons, rendering them unidentifiable. John looked at Ellison, and his lip unconsciously quivered. Teardrops rolled gently down his cheek, and he didn't bother wiping them away. He'd known she wouldn't have made it, but hearing exactly how she'd died, how she'd struggled to her last breath and failed, almost dropped him to his knees. I should have been there, he admonished himself. He might have been able to save her. Ellison shook his head. If you'd stayed, you'd have been killed too. What happened to Danny Dyson? John asked. I don't know, Ellison replied. He just disappeared. Judgment Day came July 8th, 2010. What was left of the world descended into chaos. Nobody knew what was going on. What remained of the military tried to restore order, but it was impossible. Skynet used the chaos and confusion to quietly build an army of machines while the world tore itself apart. Skynet started its main offensive 18 months later. What was left of the world's armies didn't stand a chance. We stayed in a remote village in Mexico near the coast and caught fish with the locals for a few years. It was in the middle of nowhere and pretty primitive to start with. Judgment Day didn't seem to make much of a difference to their lives, apart from the cold and the dark. While the world went to hell, I took care of Savannah. Trained her how to shoot, how to fight as best as I knew how, and how to survive. You didn't fight back? John asked. He'd have thought that after all Ellison had seen and after what he'd just told him, he'd have been fought back. I couldn't, Ellison explained. I had Savannah to take care of. If I died, she'd have been alone. Savannah looked back at them. I could have taken care of myself, she said defensively. Look on the bright side, John. You've got Cameron back, part of her at least. John nodded and allowed himself a slight smile. Ellison was right. He was much closer now than he'd hoped he could be. He had her body back, and he had a goal now to find a T-888 chip, and he now had allies to help him. Things were finally starting to look up in this post-apocalyptic hellhole. He knelt down beside Cameron's body, trying not to step on the small arsenal beneath her. He ran his hand over the intact, unblemished side of her face, where the last time he'd seen her had been jagged strips of flesh over dull metal. Cameron, he muttered, I'll get you back. He didn't trust Weaver with her. She didn't matter to the T-1000, only John Henry did. To her, Cameron was an inconvenience at best. Hey, Savannah leaned over the top of the grave as she spoke to John. This is great and all, but we didn't wait 18 years just to give you your pet metal back. John looked up at Savannah and saw the impatience on her face, even in the darkness. She couldn't let him just have a moment here. And what did she mean by that? He thought they were here to help. He looked to Ellison for support. She's right, he said to John. We didn't go to all this effort just to catch up. We've got to get you back. John raised his eyebrow at Ellison in confusion. Back? While we were in hiding, I thought about the time machine you used. It was built right into the walls. It might still be there. We need to get you back to within a week of you disappearing, or it's game over. John looked at him and saw the seriousness etched onto Ellison's face. Savannah shared the same look too. Ellison had told her everything when she'd come of age, in case anything happened to him and she'd had to carry on alone. Ellison continued. Danny Dyson's the key, John. He knew more about Kaliba than we could have ever learnt ourselves. He worked for them, helped develop Skynet. He'd know where it is. If we can get back and find him and turn him, then he can take us right to it and we can stop it. And for that we need Weaver, John replied. She's not exactly been helpful since I got here. He noticed Savannah frown and her face turn sour as he mentioned Weaver's name again. The liquid metal Terminator was clearly a sore spot for her. She'll go back when she's ready, Savannah muttered. She won't help you unless it suits her. John nodded to her. He knew now from experience that Savannah was right. Weaver had her own agenda, and to hell with anyone or anything else. Savannah peered down into the grave at Cameron in the coffin below. Still can't believe you came through time for a tin can, she smirked. She'd never understood it. Ellison had told her that John had jumped through the TDE after this Cameron cyborg, but she'd never understood it. Sure, she thought as she looked down at the deactivated machine. She was pretty. But knowing what she was, Savannah couldn't see what the attraction would be. We should move her, Savannah grunted. It's not going to be safe here for long. John and Ellison picked up the shovels again and started digging at the soil at the foot of Cameron's coffin while Savannah crouched low against the headstone and kept lookout with her HK-417 shouldered. She stared down the barrel and scanned for any signs of movement. She shivered slightly, and not just from the cold. They were too exposed out in the open. All it would take was an HK flying nearby to spot them, and they were toast. John and Ellison grunted as they worked, their breath coming out in puffs of steam and rising into the air as they dug upwards against the wall of earth and tossed the soil out onto the ground above. It took them half an hour to dig a slope leading from the coffin up to ground level. The two of them dropped their shovels and pulled the coffin up the makeshift ramp, heaving and gasping with effort until they finally cleared it out of the grave. John and Ellison sat against the coffin and panted breathlessly for a few moments. "Let's take 5, Ellison suggested between heavy breaths. Savannah tossed a canteen of water to Ellison, who gulped down a couple of mouthfuls, nodded gratefully to her, then passed it to John. The water was warm and tasted faintly of plastic, but to John, it was one of the most welcome drinks he'd ever had, as much so as the dog he'd previously eaten before his encounter with the HK and then Weaver. Starving for days on end and hardly eating anything had weakened him, he had to admit. He didn't know how Ellison, an old man now, had the strength in him. "Hope you're rested up," Savannah told him with a coy grin on her face, "because now you've got a Hall's Sleeping Beauty there back to camp. How about you give it a try?" John moaned as he and Ellison reluctantly got back up and heaved the coffin up, carrying it like a stretcher between them. "Can't, sorry. Someone's got a ride shotgun," she said as she hefted her rifle. "Convenient," John muttered. "John, drop it," Ellison said. First John thought he meant with Savannah, but then he felt the coffin sag and realized he literally meant to drop their cargo. Ellison opened up the lid and pulled out several blocks of Semtex and a number of weapons. "We should lighten the load," he said. John tilted Cameron's body to the side and pulled out an AA-12 shotgun from under the small of her back. It was fully loaded with a drum magazine and a bandolier of shells wrapped around it. John pulled its sling and the spare rounds over his shoulder and handed the M32 grenade launcher to Savannah. "One more for the collection," he said to her. She took it and pulled out a bandolier of 40mm grenades over her shoulder, crossing over the one of hand grenades she already had on. John had to smile at the sight of her so heavily armed. The M32 definitely suited her, like the minigun had Uncle Bob. "You remind me of my mom," he smirked. Mom times 10, he corrected himself. Even she hadn't gone around tooled up to the nines all the time. It was as if Savannah had modeled herself after his mom but gone way overboard. First his mom, then Cameron, and now Savannah. He wondered what it was about the women in his life all being harder than steel. Ellison took the Type 67 machine gun and the rocket launcher, and John slung the AA-12 over his back and kept the HK-417 at his hip, ready to be drawn in an instant. They divided up the ammunition evenly between the three of them, loaded magazines, pocketed grenades, and stuffed the Semtex into Savannah's pack. There was an army-style rucksack at Cameron's feet, with John written in permanent marker over the top flap. He pulled it over his shoulders, leaving only Cameron and a few boxes of 7.62mm in the coffin. John and Ellison picked up the coffin once more, now a good deal lighter, and continued. "Where are we going anyway?" he asked. "We've got safe houses around LA, Savannah explained. "We stayed in Mexico until last year before coming back here. We set up a few places to hide, nearest is in Pico." Ellison nodded from his position at the front of the coffin. "That's where we're headed." John shook his head in the tail position despite the fact neither Ellison nor Savannah could see the gesture. "We should head back where we met," he said. We won't last long downtown carrying Cameron. Ditch the coffin then, Savannah said. It's dead weight. He's right, she added, speaking to Ellison. We won't get to Pico before sunrise anyway, not carrying Tin Miss there. John looked at her for a moment. She'd definitely picked up something from the short time she'd spent with his mom. Gunfire cracked through the silent air and struck the middle of the coffin, sending splinters flying through the air. John and Ellison both dropped the casket and hit the deck as they and Savannah turned around and brought their weapons to bear, searching for targets. More shots rang out and whipped past them, accompanied moments later by blue-white bolts of plasma that burned through the air. Savannah immediately rolled away from where she'd stopped, lay prone and fired off several shots from her rifle. John and Ellison did the same, firing rapid successions of single shots in the general direction the bullet that struck the coffin came from. John glanced at the hole in the wood and hoped Cameron was okay inside. The hole was big, but it was impossible to tell the size of the round that hit. He hoped it was only something small. Contact front? Savannah screamed out shrilly as she pumped more rounds forward. My 12 o'clock, 150 meters. How many? Ellison asked as he took cover behind a grave at the edge of the cemetery. They were almost where they'd came in from, the wall they'd hidden behind only a few feet behind them now. 4 or 5, Savannah shouted back as shots cracked over her head. More plasma bolts flew in and blasted apart the headstone next to the one Ellison was using for cover. He flipped down the bipod of the Type 67 and loaded the first 100-round belt. They all had HK 417s, but he reckoned they could use the machine gun's extra firepower. John aimed his rifle and fired several single shots, seeing people advancing towards them, firing and maneuvering and taking cover behind the graves. They're not metal, he shouted out. Good. Savannah yelled back as she pulled out an empty magazine and slotted a fresh one into place, immediately returning fire again. Means they'll go down easier. Cover me! John darted forward, earning curses from both his companions as he weaved left and right between headstones, bullets whizzing around him. He dived for cover behind another grave and looked back. More bullets struck the coffin and John winced at each hit. He fired at the muzzle flashes where the rounds had come from and grinned in satisfaction as he heard a pained cry ahead of HM. Whether he'd wounded or killed them, he didn't know. Tough luck, he thought. They fired first and they were shooting at Cameron. Moving! Savannah cried out a second before she got up and ran. John and Ellison lay on heavy covering fire as the petite redhead shot forwards and ducked in behind another gravestone, the cemetery, providing the perfect natural cover in the firefight. Plasma rounds and gunshots tore through the stone and sent her scattering for more cover. Shit. Savannah grimaced as a bullet struck her in the thigh and she stumbled, still driven forwards by her own inertia. She gritted her teeth at the searing pain in her leg and ignored the blood dripping warmly down her leg and staining the front of her trousers. Her leg buckled beneath her, and as she dropped to her knees, she felt rounds whizzing inches above her head. She knew instantly if her leg hadn't collapsed on her, those bullets would have splattered her head all over the cemetery. Fuck off! She growled and fired a burst back, more angry than in pain. Keep moving, John urged her on. If they stayed still, they were dead. He was going purely on adrenaline here. He couldn't see their opponents anymore and had no idea what to do. He was just reacting to what he saw. He saw a small, long-haired silhouette through his sights and squeezed the trigger. The target dropped, but he could tell he'd missed, and she assuming it was as she had dived for cover rather than having fallen. Their opponents seemed to realize that Savannah was down and took the initiative. They advanced further towards them, and John saw one of their faces through his optical sight as she moved closer. His eyes widened in disbelief at the sight of her. The exact same face he'd seen in the coffin a few minutes ago, but it wasn't her. Allison, he breathed. How the hell had they found him? The firing stopped suddenly, and John looked around. Ellison held his position with the machine gun, but Savannah was nowhere to be seen. She disappeared completely. John could see Allison, however, only 30 meters away. She was crouched behind a headstone and held her rifle out, pointed in his direction. He looked to the side and saw her companions spread out. They'd been outflanked. "Connor, we've got you and your friends surrounded," he heard Allison shout out, her voice replacing the gunfire as the only sound. "Give yourselves up. Piss off." Savannah called out in reply as she rolled from her hiding place 200 yards away to John's right outside of Allison's team's flanking man, however. How the hell she'd gotten there without him or anyone else seeing, especially with a wounded leg, John didn't know. He hadn't even seen her move once she'd gone down. She shouldered the M32 and fired 3 times. A triple explosion roared through the air and sent clouds of dirt flying in all directions. John saw at least one man caught in the eruption, his body blasted backwards and disappearing into the plumes of smoke and flying earth. John and Ellison took that as their cue to carry on firing, as did Allison's team. Gunshots and plasma rounds rang out, and John saw even more strike the coffin until the wooden structure collapsed and Cameron's body spilt out the side and out onto the open ground. Allison peered through the scope of her M4 and saw herself roll outside the coffin. "What the fuck is that?" she screamed out. It was her. How the hell could it be her? It had to be a machine, but how? And why were they transporting it in a coffin? "It's got my face," she shouted to Kyle, crouched a few feet away from her and firing his plasma rifle. He looked through the sights of his weapon and indeed saw a Terminator that looked just like Allison. "It's got my face," she repeated over and over, edging towards hysteria at the sight of her Terminator double. "I've got it." Kyle took steady aim at the inert machine, but shots smacked into the ground around him and forced him to flee from his position. He saw the girl on their side moving and fired at her, but she was too nimble and got away before he'd pulled the trigger. His shots hit nothing but air. John roared out in anger and fired at Kyle with everything he had, desperate to keep Cameron safe from his not-father's plasma fire. "Ellison, keep firing!" he shouted out. He wanted to move around and outflank them and needed the extra fire support from the machine gun. Savannah was too far away to hear him over the din, but he knew she'd keep an eye on what he was doing. She'd know, he figured. John started to move, but something in the air lit up and caught his attention. First he thought it was an HK, but then he saw a rapid series of lights flare up in the sky, burning brilliantly like fireflies as they hung in the air, and knew it wasn't a Skynet aircraft. It wouldn't signal its arrival like that if it was. Cameron, he couldn't suppress a smile. "Ellison, Savannah, move back to the wall." John emptied the rest of his magazine at Kyle and Allison's position, then shot back 20 meters. Ellison carried on firing as John spotted Savannah dashing past gravestones on his far right. She turned and fired another grenade from the launcher, then switched to her rifle and rattled off more rounds before moving again. John made it level with Ellison and took the machine gun as the older man fell back. He hammered away at their position before he rushed to Cameron. He crouched down and looked at her for a moment and sighed with relief she was still in one piece. She'd been hit with a few assault rifle rounds, but nothing that would damage her. He lifted her up onto his shoulder in a fireman's lift before finally falling back himself. Ellison covered his retreat as he jogged as fast as he could whilst carrying Cameron and 3 large weapons. He heard the faint drone of jet engines up in the air and sprinted for all he had towards the cemetery wall. Savannah fired the M32 once more and blasted a hole in the wall. Seconds later, she ducked into it and left his view. Ellison followed, and John pushed Cameron's body through and followed after. He fired more shots, though now he couldn't see any targets. "Get down!" he shouted, knowing what was coming next. A giant flash lit up the night sky, and the ground shook beneath them as fire roiled upwards and threw out vast chunks of earth in all directions, raining it down over the cemetery. The explosion echoed loudly through the air and seemed to carry on forever before it slowly ebbed away into silence. John saw a massive crater in the ground where they'd just been, at least 100 feet in diameter. Whether or not it had gotten them all, he didn't know, but there was no more fire and no more voices. John felt a slight pang of guilt all of a sudden. They weren't his family, nor were they friends. They'd hunted him down with the intent to kill him, he was sure of it, but they were just doing what they thought they had to in order to survive. He wished he could have gotten them talking. He could have shown them Cameron, and Weaver and John Henry, and shown them they could have been allies. They could have fought together instead of trying to kill each other. Savannah reloaded her M32 and checked her rifle as Ellison took the machine gun from John and inserted a fresh belt. "Let's go," Savannah said to John. "Metal will be here to investigate, so we shouldn't hang around." John looked up into the sky once more and saw the blinking lights of the UCAV as it dipped its wings before they disappeared, and the aircraft pulled back up into the air. He couldn't help but smile again. She was always there for him. John hefted Cameron's body back over his left shoulder and carried the HK-417 in his right, and followed after Savannah as they made their way down the road they'd came in on, back towards the residential area to the east. Cameron, John's weapons, ammunition, and his new pack all weighed him down, and Ellison could see it clear as day. "You need a hand?" he asked. "No," John shook his head adamantly. "I'll carry her." After Cameron just saved his ass for the second time in the future and so many times before that, it was the least he could do in return. They reached the former suburban area just as the first rays of the sun struggled to penetrate the thick clouds of dust in the atmosphere, casting out thin slivers of weak red light that punctuated the darkness. "I'm never taking a sunrise for granted again," John said, still carrying Cameron. "This is nothing," Ellison said in the trail position behind John. "For the first couple of years after Judgment Day, you couldn't see the sun at all. It's warmer now than it was then, too. Give it a couple of years and we'd be able to start growing food again." Not that they'd be there for that, he thought. With any luck, they'd soon be able to get Cameron restored and head back to the past, back to paradise. John had never thought much about it, really, and he'd seen plenty of sunrises when he'd been training with his mom when he was a kid. They'd always been up well before dawn. His various instructors in the jungle had always said daybreak and sunset were the best times to launch an attack. The fading or growing light played havoc with night or day vision, and it took several minutes for human eyes to adjust. Tactical knowledge had definitely sucked the fun out of sunrises and sunsets for him when he was a kid. If Ellison and Savannah were right, and they managed to get back, then one of the first things he'd do, he decided, was to get up early and watch the sunrise every morning. Savannah lead the way back to the house they'd been in earlier. They entered once again through the garage door. John pulled open the back door of the Jeep and laid Cameron out on the back seat. His back and shoulders cried out with relief as her weight was removed. She wasn't really that heavy, not much more than if she were human, he thought, but combined with the weight of the pack and the weapons he was carrying, it felt like he'd had a buffalo on his shoulders. John looked down at her and smiled. He stroked one side of her face with his hand and brushed a few strands of hair aside. He could still hardly believe he was halfway there already. He had her body, and soon enough, with Ellison's and Savannah's help, he'd get the chip too. He stared at her and tried to fight the emotions stirring around inside him from coming to the surface and showing through. He wasn't all the way there yet, and he needed to try and stay focused if he was going to succeed. The feelings could come later. He knew how he felt. He shouldn't feel it for a machine, but he did. "I'll get you back," he whispered, "even if it kills me. You realize she's not only a cyborg, but she's not even active, right?" Savannah's comment tore his attention away from Cameron. "She's a paperweight. Just think about that before you decide to get a room." She could see the fondness he had for the machine. She didn't really care about that all that much. She found it curious the guy Ellison told her was meant to beat the machines was fawning all over one, but whatever. She'd met a lot of weirdos since the world ended, and compared to most of them, John's affection for a tin can was nothing. "Just ignore her," Ellison told John as the younger man opened his mouth to make a reply. "She just likes winding people up." "You're no fun," Savannah retorted playfully. The three of them left Cameron's body in the car and headed into the house proper. They swept the house once again, making sure they were the only ones there. Once they'd confirmed they were, they headed into the living room, and Savannah shrugged off her coat, hat, and pack and threw herself onto the dusty leather sofa in one corner, as John and Ellison set their things down on the floor. Savannah unselfconsciously pulled her combat trousers down, revealing slender, pale legs and pink underwear. John glanced at her nether region for a moment and couldn't help but smile and shake his head. "What?" Savannah stared at him. "Never seen a girl undress before?" Knowing this wet-behind-the-ears kid, probably not, she guessed. "It's not that," John smirked. "Well, what is it?" she asked. She looked at him and tried to work out what it was. He was fawning over his cyborg a minute ago, so she didn't think he was looking at her in that way. "It's them," John said with a grin and gestured at her underwear. It definitely didn't mix with the hard-as-nails tough girl he'd seen so far. Camouflage-colored boxer shorts with a knife sewn into the waistband and a gun stuffed down the front would have been more suited to her, he thought. "You're right," Savannah rolled her eyes. "They'd probably suit you better." She touched the gunshot wound on her thigh and winced in pain. John and Ellison came closer and looked at it. The bullet had skimmed the outside of her thigh and gouged a crater in the flesh 1/2 inch deep. It was still bleeding, and John was surprised she'd made it all the way back. It had been several miles from the house to the cemetery, and Savannah hadn't complained once. She'd even led the way and set the pace. "Just a flesh wound," Ellison said. "It'll need stitches, but you'll be okay." John saw the look in Ellison's eyes as he inspected the wound. He saw the concern the former agent clearly felt for Savannah. These two had lived together for 18 years, had hidden together, fought together. They reminded him a little of himself and his mom when he was younger. Savannah pulled out a small metal tin from her pack and opened it up, revealing a few meager medical supplies, a needle and a spool of black thread. She opened up a bottle of pure alcohol and poured some on the wound, gritting her teeth against the pain. John watched as Ellison threaded the needle and pierced her skin with it repeatedly, sewing the wound closed. Savannah winced slightly as he worked, but made no sound other than the occasional sharp breath. She had a high pain threshold, John noted, looking at her with admiration. She was so much like his mom he could hardly believe it. He wondered if she'd modeled herself after the stories Ellison had probably told her. Savannah caught him looking at the impromptu surgery and saw the look on his face. "Not the first time I've been shot," she said. She pulled up her sweater and undershirt slightly and showed John a small round pink entry wound scar on the right side of her belly, just slightly above her navel. John looked closer at her and saw there were a number of small scars on her neck that looked like they went down her back and chest. Ellison probably had similar ones too, he reckoned. It just reminded him of how hard life was for people here. He'd had it easy so far, John thought. He didn't think he'd be able to last a few years in this future. After a few minutes, Ellison was done and he wrapped a thick white square of cloth over the stitched-up wound. Savannah pulled her trousers back up and sat back down on the sofa. "Rest it," Ellison told her. "And that's an order. We don't need those stitches popping open." "What's in the bag?" Savannah asked John, pointing to the pack he'd taken out of the coffin. John opened it up and pulled the drawstring loose. He reached in and pulled out an olive-colored sleeping bag, then extracted several large, clear plastic bags that had been vacuum-sealed. He ripped them open and revealed a thick winter coat, 2 sets of clean clothes, and a pair of size 11 boots. Beneath that was a sealed plastic bag containing medical supplies, bandages, dressings, water-purifying tablets, and a small stash of broad-spectrum antibiotics and a pack of 3 syringes to go with them, plus spare needles. "Another gift from your mom," Ellison explained. Sarah had definitely thought ahead all those years ago. "Go and get changed out of that outfit and we'll put some food on," he said. He handed John a canteen of water. "For washing," he added. "Get some rest after you're done. I'll take first watch." John nodded and went upstairs to change, taking the backpack and his weapons with him. He pulled off the filthy tunnel rat's clothes and stood naked in front of the bathroom mirror. His body was covered in bruises from sleeping rough and from impacts when he'd had to dive for cover several times. He was dirty and realized suddenly that he stank. He hadn't bathed in weeks and knew there'd be no showers in this day and age. He rummaged through the side pouches of the pack and found a bar of soap and a flannel, a straight razor and a hand towel. He looked at his face and saw in disgust the short, scruffy beard he'd grown since arriving in the future. He not only smelt like a tunnel rat, but he was starting to look like one. He turned on the faucet from force of habit, but nothing came out. Of course, he chided himself. Running water probably ran out only hours after the bombs had dropped. Instead, he opened up Ellison's canteen and splashed some of the water on his face, then set to work shaving off several weeks' growth. There was no shaving foam, and it was a quick, dirty job that resulted in several cuts and nicks by the time he was finished. He then poured some water onto the flannel and worked in the bar of soap. He took a few minutes to wash himself with just the wet flannel and bar of soap, but by the end of it, he felt much, much better. He started to dress himself and marveled at how good it felt just to put on a clean set of boxer shorts and socks. He donned a pair of combat trousers and a fresh t-shirt and sweater. Once he was fully dressed and had his boots laced up, he felt almost like a new man. He went into the bedroom he'd used before and sprawled out on the sofa, physically and emotionally exhausted. He knew he should clean his rifle after using it, but he was just too tired. He'd not fired it that much and decided it could wait a few hours. He did, however, remove the magazine and ejected the chambered round. He slotted it back into the top of the magazine and slid it back into place, but didn't cock the rifle. He wouldn't accidentally blow his brains out whilst he slept, and when he needed to, he could chamber the round. His training took over once again, and he cradled the rifle in his arms as he lay on his back and closed his eyes and started to think about their next move. He had Cameron back in body, but not in chip. The only way Weaver would give her back to him was if he gave her at least one T-888 chip for John Henry to transfer into. How would she even do that? He wondered. Was Weaver also working on a way to download John Henry onto a separate chip, honoring her promise, or was she going to go back on her word? John wouldn't be surprised if she did, and knew he had to think of a backup in case things went south. Slow down, he told himself. Before he could worry about that, they first had to get the chip. It'd be one hell of a tough job. He knew from experience that when you did manage to kill a Terminator, you normally had to blow it away completely, but they couldn't afford to just blast it with rockets and grenades, or they'd risk damaging the chip. John took some comfort in having Cameron's body back, but he knew they still had a long way to go. He was still thinking about how to get the chip as he drifted into an uneasy sleep. "Come on, it's not much further," Allison urged Kyle. She held him up as they hobbled through the ruinous streets and clung close to the buildings for cover. Kyle grunted in pain and limped, leaning heavily on her shoulder for support, and grimaced every time he put weight on his left leg. He'd caught pieces of shrapnel in his back, buttocks, and a large, jagged chunk had cut into his calf. They'd managed to staunch the bleeding for now, but every step was agony for him. Still, he thought, he was luckier than Mason and Briggs. Mason had been caught in the grenade explosions and Briggs had bought it in the airstrike. "I need to stop," Kyle groaned, feeling himself sagging even with Allison holding him up. His leg just didn't want to cooperate. The calf had swollen and was so stiff he could barely move his foot. "We can't, the sun's almost up," she said. "We need to get underground before dawn." Still, she felt Kyle slipping from her. She knew it was no good. He wasn't going to make it back to the sewers and she couldn't carry him on her own. She looked around and saw an overturned van laid on its side. Its cab was invisible, hidden in the walls of the building it had crashed or been thrown into. The back doors were open and she could see it was empty inside. "In there," she pointed to it. "Come on, just a few yards to go," she urged him on, pulling him with her. Kyle looked at the van, 20 meters away, and pushed himself towards it, using every ounce of strength he had to keep limping. Finally, after a lot of pain, grunting, and cursing, they made it inside the back of the van, and Kyle lowered himself down onto his backside. He leaned against the floor of the van and groaned in relief, panting with exertion and pain. "Cassie, come on!" Cassie followed in after Allison and sat beside Kyle. She licked his face and nuzzled his cheek affectionately, and Allison couldn't help but smile. Cassie was always good like that. She'd always known when she was in pain and curled up with her, though she'd never been like that with anyone else before. Allison pulled the doors inwards, closing them as much as she could and blocking out some of the icy cold wind. She pulled out her radio and switched it on. Allison to Derek, come in. It took a few moments of static before she heard anything back. I'm here, Allison. What's your position and situation? Bad, she replied. Connor got away, Mason and Briggs are dead, Kyle's wounded and we can't get back before sunrise. We're taking shelter downtown on 9th Street. We've relocated, Derek told her. She could hear the concern in his voice even through the garbled transmission. She could imagine him right now, looking at a map and pinpointing where they were. There's a manhole cover on 13th Street. Head there, get into the tunnel and wait, and we'll RV with you in an hour. Allison looked over at Kyle. He'd pulled up his trouser leg and taken the dressing off. The shrapnel was still in his leg and was stopping him from walking, but without any real medical supplies on her person, she didn't want to risk pulling it out. Can you make it to 13th Street? She asked him. Kyle looked back and she saw the pain on his face as he shook his head. He was done. He couldn't walk anymore and Allison couldn't carry him. Kyle can't walk, she spoke into the radio. He's got shrapnel in his leg. We won't make it there before the sun's up. Got that. Wait where you are. We'll come to you. 1 hour. Allison turned off her radio and stuffed it back into her pack. She pulled out her canteen of water and handed it to Kyle, who gulped it down furiously. Despite the cold, he'd been sweating like a pig from the effort of going several miles on his wounded leg, and his throat was parched. Allison crawled over to him and checked the wound. There wasn't much she could do for him right now. We're gonna have to wait to pull the shrapnel out, she told him as she looked closely at it. It was in pretty deep. It might have nicked a vein. If it has and I pull it out, you'll lose too much blood. We'll never be able to move you. Can you hang on? Not like I've got a lot of choice. Kyle winced at Allison's gentle prodding. Allison sat down close to Kyle, their sides pressed together, and she leaned into him. Cassie flopped down on top of their laps and snuggled up with the pair of them. It was cold outside, and now they'd stopped moving, it would only get worse, even sheltered from the wind. They needed all the warmth they could get, and the only source of it out here was from each other. I've been thinking, Kyle said to Allison as she rested her head against the crook of his neck. He wrapped his arm around her and leaned into her. Connor, I'm not so sure anymore he's really working for Skynet. Allison pulled away from him and stared as if he'd grown another head, shock taking over from her need for warmth. What? She couldn't believe what she was hearing, not from Kyle. He'd lost as many friends as her because of John. She tapped the side of his head. You get some shrapnel in your brain, too, she asked. Had he forgotten what had just happened to them? Think about it, Kyle said to her, pulling her back into him. They were using guns, not plasma rifles, ordinary guns. Since when does Skynet give its units assault rifles? What about the airstrike? She countered. It was giving Connor and his guys air support so they could escape. Have you ever seen an HK launch flares like that before? It bombed us, Allie. HKs only ever use plasma. That wasn't any kind of Skynet plane. That's it, Allison asked, feeling her patience wearing thin. What about the metal? She asked. They had a Terminator, remember it? It was me. She felt herself tearing up as she recalled seeing her mirror image in the coffin. They copied me, she sobbed slightly. And why the hell was it buried in a coffin? Kyle had to admit that didn't make sense to him at all. He'd seen it too, and it was freaky, but something else about it was even weirder. Did you take a look at the coffin? He asked. Of course I did, she shot back. She pulled away from Kyle and held Cassie closer to her. I know what I saw. Not the metal, I saw that too, Kyle said. The coffin. Did you get a good look at the coffin itself? Allison shook her head. How could she have even worried about that when she'd seen her machine double laid out in a casket? What kind of sick games were John and his friends trying to play with them? I did, Kyle continued. That thing was years old. He'd seen puffs of dust come from the thing when it spilt open. What they put in there was buried a long time ago. That doesn't make any sense, Allison said. How could they have an exact copy of me that's been buried for years? How'd they know exactly what I'd look like? Nor does John scurrying around like he has been, Kyle said, feeling the cold slightly more now that Allison had pulled away from him. He didn't want to upset her, but at the same time he had to question it. Now they'd stopped the chase and had had some time to reflect on it. He realized so many things just didn't add up. We chased him all across LA, he carried on. Why didn't he just go straight back to Skynet or give himself up to the first endo patrol he saw? They'd found a number of John's camps, but why was he even hiding? He could have flagged down an endo squad and been sitting pretty eating steak in some Skynet base within 24 hours, instead of camping out alone on the freezing surface. People who worked for Skynet did so either because they believed the machines would win and wanted to get on what they'd thought was the right side, or because they didn't like starving and decided to eat from the devil's table. They sat in silence, both deep in thought about John, his new friends, Allison's double, and everything else about the kid that just didn't add up. Something outside moved and Cassie shot upright onto all fours and gave out a low growl. Kyle and Allison snatched up their weapons as their heart rates soared in fear and anticipation. They heard footsteps outside, coming closer to them. They were stuck in the van with no way out, trapped. They shared a nod between them and clutched their weapons tightly. Something outside pulled and twisted at the handle, then started shaking at the jammed doors. A cold bead of sweat ran down Allison's temple, and she found herself shaking as a horrific mental image came to mind. Her Terminator double on the other side, ripping the doors open and coming in to slaughter them. Fuck it, she grit her teeth. If it was her double or any other tin, it was going to get a face full of her bullets and Kyle's plasma before it took them. The doors flew open with a rusty squeal, and light flooded the inside of the van. Kyle lowered his plasma rifle and let out a deep breath of relief as he saw Derek and Mac behind the glare of the flashlights. Allison lowered her M4 and leaned back against the wall. "We almost killed you," she said. "Why?" Derek asked as he and Mac moved into the van and helped get Kyle back up to his feet. Mac wrapped Kyle's arm over his shoulder and took his weight. "What did I do?" he asked jokingly. Neither of them laughed. Kyle looked at Allison and then back to his brother. Derek needed to know what had happened, even if Allison thought he was wrong.